So let's get so we'll get started. I have a lot of slides, but some of them are a little silly just because we need a mental break when we're doing time and effort. Um, and some of them have a lot of information that may not go over word for word, but I wanted you to have it available to take back and look at. So if I'm going too fast, just ask me to slow down. I can be here as long as you need me today. So the time and the what now. People sometimes hear time and effort and they're like, what is going on? If you're newer to these kinds of positions that you all are in, it may sound a little crazy, but we'll go through it. We'll talk a little bit about why it's done and what it's all about, who needs to do it, and then we'll talk a little bit about how you can do it. And there's quite a few ways. So we're kind of going to give some samples and work through them, I think, a little bit. So first, a little history. So I call it the before times. When I started this job back 12 years ago, we were working with requirements that were stated throughout different OMB circulars is what they called them. It was from the Office of Management and Budgets, and it was details on how different laws applied to federal funds specifically, right? So we had all these three circulars that we used to reference. And then what happened is in about 2014, the Uniform Grants Guidance came out and that replaced the OMB circulars. So if you've been doing this job a while and you've been working with time and effort, the before time is very familiar. That's when the law was very prescriptive as to what you had to do. It told you exactly what the forms were and how to have them. And then kind of left some vague things in there too, but like for the most part, pretty specific. And that's where you get the terminology that you're used to hearing that I heard in some of your riddles, the semi-annual, periodic activity report, or PAR. So those terms all come from the days of OMB circulars. When the Uniform Grants Guidance came out in 2014, things kind of shifted a little. They got more vague. They basically said, you know what? You keep time and effort however you think is appropriate for your LEA, as long as you have adequate internal controls to ensure that everything that we told you before to do is accounted for somehow. So it's, some freedom, but it's also a little scary because what does that mean? Like, what do we do? The other caveat they said was if you don't have those internal controls in place, we expect you to do what you did back in the OMB days. So helpful, but not a little scary. And, CDE's guidance is always show us what you do, show us your procedures that detail your internal controls, show us that you follow them. And if you don't have any of that, we expect to see PARs and semi-annuals that are very specifically done to a level of detail that probably would drive everyone crazy, right? It's not an easy process. So the why. So time and effort is really to ensure that you have checks and balances in place to adequately document that you're charging the programs correctly, right? The federal government is giving you a bunch of money. They're saying, okay, you're doing this. We know what you plan to do. Now show us that you did it that way. So that's really just making sure that, there's no harm to the federal programs and that, you are accounting for everything that you should be thinking about to ensure that those programs are protected and really serving the purpose that they're supposed to serve. So really not meant as a form of torture. It feels that way sometimes, even to us as monitors, it gets difficult going through some of these documents. So it's really, really crucial that you have a system put in place. So who needs to do this? And what is it really? So we're saying time and effort. We're looking for records that show the work that was performed, not what you hoped to perform or what you budgeted to perform, but really what happens. So any single employee who is paid with, this sounds dramatic, but a penny out of federal funds that are federally restricted, needs to keep some form of documentation that meets your LEA's standards and procedures. We also like to remind you the False Claims Act is something that is applicable to this. So this documentation is meant to be actual representation of what happened. And anything that you put forth that is false, whether knowingly or not, could be subject or liable to penalties. If you keep going that way in that direction and it's never fixed, once it's been identified especially, then it starts getting into kind of a murkier water there. CDE doesn't take that action, but if the federal government were to come to you, all of your documentation is liable to these kinds of fees if you're not keeping it up to par. So not a fun slide, but a good reminder that these are documents that are official to the LEA. And then I always like to say records. Let's define it. We're not talking about the vinyls you put on the player. If anyone even still does that anymore, I might be the only person who still does that. But it really is a documentation constituting evidence of the past. So this is a really great reminder. We're not talking about your pre-budgeted stuff. And when we're saying past, we also don't mean that you create it, a year later. It's going to be something that's contemporaneous to your process, but just a reminder that these are actual records, not just predetermined reports. And I think you're going to hear that a few times. So will a time card work then? This is a question we get asked pretty often. And the answer is maybe, but probably not. The reason for that is the requirements for federally restricted programs require documentation of more information to determine a cost as allocable. And we'll talk about what that means, but just want to put that out there right now. The first foremost question, the time card. Maybe, but probably not. So what's some of those requirements? This is going to be kind of the boring part, and it probably won't make a ton of sense until we get into looking at samples, but wanted you to have these to look at. But the way that the UGG states it is that first and foremost, your documentation has to be supported by a system of internal controls. And the whole reason for that is to ensure that, there's little room for error or inconsistencies, right? You have a standardized process, you have controls in place to ensure that it's followed and that everything's being recorded accurately. Whatever documentation you keep for time and effort needs to be incorporated into your official records. I think that goes along with your internal controls. If it's a standardized process, obviously it's a part of your official records. And you have to have that documentation reflect the total activity for which the employee is compensated. And I think this part is a little misleading and sometimes kind of gets misinterpreted. So when we say total activity for an employee, we're not saying you only record the information that's charged to the restricted program. It's really talking about the entire position that the employee works. If they were compensated, you need to, and out of any funding source, you need to reflect all of that in their time and effort if they are having multiple funding sources, right? Or multiple cost objectives that they're meeting. Again, will make more sense as we go forward and we talk about what that looks like. Additional requirements. Oh, I think this is what I just said. Encompass all activities, both federal and non-federal. And it has to also be a process that you've established that also is in alignment with your accounting policies and practices. So it's going to be really important that you're actually, when you're putting these processes together, that you are accounting for all the different departments that are involved in it, which in the end includes your accounting, right? So be sure that you're being consistent across your offices. And then the documentation has to support a distribution among specific activities or cost objectives. So that's basically saying, hey, if you're keeping this documentation, you have to identify your cost objectives. And I think that'll get kind of to be an old, repetitive thing that you'll hear whenever you're doing a presentation like this or you're being reviewed. Cost objectives are going to be a main topic. So we will, of course, talk about that a bit too. Okay, so keeping all of this in mind, can we use a position control report or an FTE report? This is another question we get sometimes, and sometimes we don't even get asked it. We just get submitted documentation that is like that. And when it comes to time and effort, this could be a problem. So again, I'm going to say maybe, but probably not, right? And there's multiple reasons. Most of them center around that idea of cost objectives. An FTE or position control report doesn't typically identify cost objectives. The other portion or the other part where you might have a problem is that those reports are usually based on predetermined budget. And so they're going to give me not the actual activity after the fact, or they're going to report it in only percentages and not really support those cost objectives potentially. So there could be some problems. In certain cases, it may work, but it's pretty limited. We'll talk a little more about that in our samples. Okay, so standards for document of personnel expenses, slide 5. I heard this said on your riddles. Budget estimates alone do not qualify as support. And that's where we get to that whole portion about you have to identify after the fact, right? This is one of the top reasons for findings in the fiscal reviews that my team does. There may be other program offices who look at time and effort as well that may have similar issues. But again, it's because the whole purpose of time and effort is to actually say, how did you actually spend the time, right? So if you're giving us just budget estimates, additional questions will follow. And that's something to keep in mind is when we do these reviews, there will always be additional questions asked and additional documentation requested to try and get us to meeting compliance or understanding how we can help you meet compliance. But if it is just budget estimates that you have and nothing else, it's not likely to be allowable as documentation for time and effort. So cost objectives. We're going to start with the easier one, a single cost objective. So this is the definition or about the definition that we have in the guidance, saying a single function, grant, or activity, or when you are having multiple funding sources, right? But the work being performed and the population served are allowable under both of them. So a lot of times, maybe you don't have enough Title I to cover all of a position, and it's funded in part by general fund, but they're not changing their duties from hour to hour. Maybe they're an intervention specialist for Title I, and that's all they're doing all day. They're still working a single cost objective despite the fact that they have multiple funding sources, right? So cost objectives are not necessarily the program funding source. They're really about the activity that you're performing that benefits the program. So if you're differentiating your activity, that's different. But when you're having two funding sources and they're in alignment, you're more than likely working a single cost objective. So multiple cost objectives, right, would kind of be the opposite. It would be you have multiple funding sources, but they're not considered a single cost objective because you're differentiating your work for a different population. You're providing different services, even if it's to the same population. It could be different things, right? So if you're working, let's say, you administer part of the Title III program, right? And you're working on the administrative side, but then you're also providing small group intervention specifically for ELs. You're serving that same population, but you're differentiating your services drastically in that one's a direct service and one's an indirect service. That's considered a multiple cost objective, even if you're using that same funding source. So it can get really sticky if you're not careful. At the same time, if you're an intervention specialist, but some of the time you're doing it for Title I students only who could be ELs, but maybe they're not only ELs, but then you're also serving some of your time as an intervention specialist specifically to ELs. Now you're working multiple cost objectives. So it's really going to depend on what your duties are and how you're funded as a part of it, but it's not the whole story. So looking at single and multiple cost objectives becomes a fun game of figuring out who am I serving, how are we doing it, and why are we funded the way we are? Is it a necessity out of funding and what we have available, or is it this is in alignment with my cost objectives? It could go either way. So I know multiple cost objectives are a little funky and a little difficult sometimes. So if you have questions about this, don't be afraid to ask them. I wanted to give a list of examples of cost objectives. So as you can see here, administrating a Title I program is a cost objective. Intervention is a cost objective. We also have English learner instruction assistance, targeted small group, and then Title II professional development for coaching or teachers, right? So these are all things you could easily identify as a cost objective. So before we were saying, you know, your funding source is not necessarily your cost objective. Also, your position may not be your cost objective either, right? If it says teacher, that's not going to tell me how that's meeting a cost objective for Title II. Maybe you're a lead teacher who does coaching. Okay, that gives me a little more information. So it's kind of a combination of like the activities that you're doing, what your position is, and what your funding source is. You really have to consider all of these different areas to kind of get a full picture of how to determine what your cost objectives are and what you need to put on your documentation. So keys to compliance, of course, is going to be those procedures and controls I kind of referenced in the very beginning. I don't have a lot of slides on procedures and controls in this presentation, and it's partially because there's not one single requirement, right? It's really dependent on what your system is within the LEA. It is a major driver for your documentation and it meeting your requirements. So it's something you should really think about. So these are key things you can think about when you're building your procedures, if you don't have them already, to ensure that you have everything developed to the extent that you need it, should you be monitored or audited, right? So policies and procedures are required. You should update them regularly. And updating them does really mean getting everyone involved. So your management and your superintendent should know about it. The program offices obviously need to know about it. The fiscal staff that need to reconcile at the end, they should be collaborating on what this is, because they can tell you whether your system is going to work on the back end when they get the information later on, right? Because it's not just a programmatic requirement. It really goes down to how do you reconcile what we budgeted versus what actually happened in the end. So those strong internal controls are key. Usually more than one person should be reviewing them, or at least how federal funds are spent. And if that means having multiple people sign off on the form or having it route a certain direction, then that's something you should take into account when you're building your procedures. Anyone who's going to be reviewing those forms should be calibrating and making sure that they're determining things the same way. And, you know, obviously they have to be trained on what the procedures are, what the law is, to make sure that they're not, you know, unintentionally making a mistake in how they're approving things going forward. And then again, I know I'd already said it, but include reconciliation as part of your process. That means once, you know, once you've received a certain amount of time and effort that you've determined by your procedures, whether it be semi-annually, annually, quarterly, whatever your determination ends up being, you should have a process in place that says, okay, this is what we budgeted. This looks like what it actually happened. There's a variance of X, Y, Z. And do we make adjustments? And when do we make those adjustments? So your reconciliation is something you're probably going to have to build pretty strongly with your accounting or business office, right? Because you're going to have to really make those adjustments, but they probably have other timelines that they have to consider too for other things. So it's really going to take a collaboration between the program and the accounting offices to kind of make sure that everyone's on the same page. Stated here, it says variances greater than 10% should be adjusted quarterly. Less than 10% could be adjusted annually. This is what is stated in the California School Accounting Manual. And so that's the suggested guidance from CDE. That's actually what CDE does as well. So to give an example, I'm budgeted out at the beginning of the year. We actually place the budget, we build it the year before, right? And then every month I fill out a timesheet and I have a backup documentation that's all my activities. So you can see my cost objectives and where I charged everything, which is above and beyond what most people in CDE do. But because of the varied things that I do, I have to do that, right? I definitely work multiple cost objectives. And then what happens is that we turn those in monthly, but our accounting department pays us on the budget. And then what they do is they go back quarterly and they look at all of my submissions and they recalculate to see where the variances are, if at all, over the quarter. And if it's more than 10%, then they adjust it in their records, right? So it shouldn't be something that delays or informs the payment of the person, but it should be something that affects your budgeting and your numbers in the background when you're closing books. So that is definitely a key thing that you should have a process for in your procedures. There are other circumstances to consider, of course. There's things like stipends or additional duty pay, extra hours. You're still required to keep time and effort documentation for any time charged to the program. So what that looks like can be very different. Usually when we see extra duty or additional duty pay, it's for a training they attended outside of their normal hours, or it's they stayed behind to do work on something for a particular program. And if there's a big group of people, you could do a blanket certification document that's pretty general, because everyone's going to be charging to the same program. It's going to be one thing that they're all doing. It's a one-time thing, and a supervisor could sign off on it. If you had an extra hour time card that was really specific, you could use that. But I will say I've seen them before. They're not usually specific enough because they don't mention cost objectives. So that one I'm a little more iffy on. But then again, if it's a training, it could be as simple as show us the training agenda, slides, and sign in and out sheet so we can see who was there, how long, and what was covered so we can determine the cost objective. So you really have to think about how often do we have extra hours that are charged to these programs, and what areas or for what purpose do we usually have them, and create and build that into your procedures as to what you want or what you expect to be documented as far as time and effort if those cases should arise. So, okay, we've talked a lot about theoretically what things have to be, and I've kind of referred to things on forms, but we haven't really talked about what the forms are. So how do we do that? So going back to my reference earlier about the California School Accounting Manual, that's something put out not by my office, but another office within CDE that talks about how to do time and effort for any restricted program, state or federal, because there are some state programs that have some restrictions as well. So it's a little more general. I will say they give you samples for periodic or semi-annual certifications, whatever you want to call it. I think they call it periodic personnel certification. Usually we say semi-annual. So they have examples of that. They have their sample of a personnel activity report, and then they talk about substitute systems. I'm not really going to talk about substitute systems because that was written back in the OMB days, right? And it's not really necessary to have substitute systems anymore because you could build your own system and it doesn't matter as long as you have it in your procedures. But it is a good reference point if you want to go in and look at alternate ways that the state has in the past recommended people use. There are some systems in there, but one is very difficult and one of them is pretty easy, but it's only applicable to certain circumstances. So you have to be careful. I would say the other thing to keep in mind, if you're looking at the California School Accounting Manual, because it is a state, written for state or federal restricted programs, their samples might not exactly meet all the federal requirements, which is really misleading and frustrating. Believe me, we've been trying to get around that and tiptoe and help people around that for years. And it's unfortunate that it doesn't meet all the requirements. They do have a little caveat on all their slides that say that, this sample might not meet all requirements, which makes it feel kind of frustrating and pointless, but we're going to actually look through some of them. Some of the samples I used are from there, and I'll tell you where you have to be careful if you're looking at them. So it's still not specific because they just give samples and they give you old jargon, which isn't helpful in this new world. So let's talk a little more about common forms. So semi-annual certifications, those are typically in the past, at least in the OMB days, they were semi-annual, so twice a year, for staff only who are working on a single cost objective, or if they work multiple cost objectives, on a set schedule, right? That's not going to fit every position that you have, but it's going to fit some. So if you're doing that, you could do a semi-annual. If they work on multiple cost objectives, you just have to attach the schedule with it so it can be identified that it's never changing, right? Because that's the whole idea behind semi-annuals, is that you can do it twice a year. You could even do it once a year now under these new requirements, right? You get to build the system, but you have to think about the risk and whether that's going to work. So if they're working a single cost objective or they have a set schedule, there's no expectation that their position would change, that they would ever serve other cost objectives or in another breakout or proportion. So doing a certification that says, I work on this single cost objective or this set of cost objectives on a set schedule every day, every month, for this year or this 6-month period, could be enough as long as you have all your controls in place to ensure that it's consistent, right? Another form is blanket semi-annual certification. So that's saying you have a group of people who work the same identified single cost objective. And I'll show you some samples where it's a little bit different than that. But again, these are definitions kind of based on the old OMB. So the idea behind a blanket semi-annual certification is I'm a staff member or I'm an administrator who has staff members who all work on the same single cost objective. And so I sign off saying these people all work this cost objective or for this amount of time, and I sign off on it because I have direct knowledge because I'm their manager. So I can go ahead and do a blanket statement, one form for all those people because I know what they all do and it's all the same thing. Not always applicable to everyone. If you have staff that do multiple things, it may not be the way to go, but it's an option. The last one is the one that everyone always dreads. It's been around forever, and that's periodic activity report or PAR. Some people have some different definitions for it, but it's basically like doing a daily accounting of all of your cost objectives down to a certain increment of time. So some people do it by hour, some people do it down to a half hour. If you're crazy like the Department of Ed, you're doing it down to the quarter hour. So that's what my glorious life is when I'm doing mine, is going down to the quarter hour, how much time I spend on every activity. I do not recommend that for anyone, but that is what our system is built for. So just to give you a point of comparison. So let's look at some samples. And I say the good, the bad, the ugly, because the reality is none of them are stellar. None of them are terrible. I don't think. There might be one. But there's always good and bad to every format. And this goes across every LEA I've been to. This goes even to the department. Not everything's perfect, and your system's only going to be as good as your controls. And that includes how well you train your staff and how you format your forms and how often you update things. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put a sample on the slide, and we'll just talk about the good and the bad and if there's some ugly. On your handouts that I gave to Lily, I have all of these on there because they might be easier to read. They might not. Some of these are difficult to read. And that's just the nature of whoever scanned them in the first place. But I also included like little places where you could take notes about what might work or what might not work. And that way you can kind of think through that process as well. So let's go to the first one. Okay, so this is a semi-annual certification. This did come from CSAM. So the first few are going to be from CSAM. So these are the samples that may or may not meet requirements according to what they note, right? So you'll see that they have period covered, in what fiscal year, the employee's name, where they're working. And then their middle row it says cost objective / program title, account or resource, and then how much of the effort they're working on it, which this is a semi-annual, so we would expect it to say 100% every time. They also have a box for supervisory. It says employee or supervisory official. So employee would sign if they have it available, or their supervisor has direct knowledge is the idea behind this format. Are there any thoughts on what's good and what might not be so good on this page? You don't have to be afraid. There's no wrong answer.
Pretty straightforward is what we're hearing.
Okay, pretty straightforward. It is pretty straightforward, and a semi-annual should be, right? It's 100% single cost objective. What do you guys think about how they're formatting in that middle row with their cost objective? Are there any thoughts on that? It's okay if you're scared, I say.
I'm not hearing it. What is account 1111? Is that like Title 1 Part D?
That's a good question. I mean, that part's like a little unknown, because they're leaving it kind of vague, right, for this sample. They're just putting 111 to fill the space on the sample. But so my comment here is, it says cost objective / program title, and it says it's program ABC. This form doesn't really give us a lot of information as to what the actual cost objective might be. Maybe the program is the cost objective, but alone, I can't tell that. I don't know what this person's position is, because they don't have a place to tell me what the position is. So they can't write in intervention specialist and then Title I like that. I would kind of put that together. I could kind of figure out the cost objective is Title I intervention if they had a position listed, but they don't really have that specific. So on the surface, it looks like they have everything they need, but it leaves me with a little bit more questions, right? It's not a terrible, egregious error. It's just something that could use a little zhuzhing. It needs a little something to give me more information. Because if I was on a review and I got this document and I didn't have the position title, and I just had this information, I would have to ask for more information to justify that it's allowable, right? I would need to say, why is it program ABC? What did they do? Who did they serve? So that's when, if you've been through an FPM, right, we ask for duty statements to kind of help back up what we're seeing in the time and effort, because sometimes the time and effort isn't complete enough to tell. If you're doing a really great job on some of these forms, we might not have to look at that stuff at like duty statements or additional documentation. But if we're unsure, we're going to ask for more.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So during our LCAP training, totally unrelated to this, we teach who is doing what for whom, as far as writing an action that way. Might that work for a cost objective? Like, who is doing what for whom? So it's an intervention teacher. Are they providing services for what student group? Because I heard you say it matters what population of students you might be providing services for. Might that capture what's needed in a cost objective?
It might be sufficient. It might even keep us from having to do, ask for duty statements or whatever. I mean, I think we ask for duty statements regardless, just in case, so we don't have to bug you again later about it. But we might not even need to look at it if it's all encapsulated in that form. So if you had a little space to kind of give a little more about the duties or who you're serving or whatnot, it might work. And I think there's a sample coming in a few slides that has a format that is kind of similar to that idea. So yeah, but that's a great question. So there's lots of good on this one, just kind of leaves a little bit of question. It's not too terrible on this one. Okay, this one's a sample of a blanket periodic or blanket form where you have multiple employees working same cost objective under the same supervisor. So this one's also from CSAM. So it's a little bit different though, because this one has, a place where they're mentioning position, and they have this cost objective line. Overall, when you look at this, is there anything that you guys see that is a major win, or is something that of note that you think you could use, or is it something is there anything that sticks out as something bad or ugly, as my original slide said?
Is it for
for multiple employees?
This is for multiple employees.
You're allowed to do that?
Yes. So that's we talked about it a little bit on a previous slide about people who are working the same single cost objective and have the same supervisor could have a blanket form. So on this, you'll see this, there's no employee signature on here. The supervisor is signing off saying, all of these employees of mine work the same single cost objective. Here's the cost objective, here's their funding, and then here's who it accounts for. So you could have the employee sign here too. I guess they do have that, but you don't absolutely need it. You just have to have at least the supervisor. Is there anything that sticks out as strange, weird, bad, doesn't sit well with you for any reason on this form?
Would this form be appropriate for a migrant summer learning program?
Yeah, it could be very, very easily could be a migrant summer learning program format that you could use. As long as everyone's working the same cost objective, it should be fine. And that actually is probably a really good example for how this particular sample could work. My major question, because it is just a sample and not a real one, it's kind of hard to tell, and they don't have cost objectives named. When I look at positions, I see teachers and then instructional assistants and tutors and then a guidance counselor. I kind of don't know what single cost objective those could all fit under. So that's my beef with this sample more than anything. It's just that would raise some questions for me automatically, is how are these all these people working the same single cost objective? And there are cases, like you said, the migrant summer program could be a case where this would be applicable. Very rare situations with like school-wide school programs, you might be able to do that if you're consolidating that. But most cases, I would guess that the people would probably have the same cost objective or the same position kind of detailed there. And it's kind of the easier way to do it.
Glad you added that, April. So that was a wondering, but I'm not an expert at time and effort, but I'm understanding cost objective to being what you are doing. I think it's confusing because you have the word cost, so I'm thinking it's funding, what funding source. So I was wondering, how would a guidance counselor do the same thing as an instructional assistant? I'm glad you added that, because I was afraid to say that out loud. But because I'm gathering that cost objective is what they are doing, not the funding.
Yeah, I mean, it could be in this case, maybe they have some crazy specific intervention program built that incorporates a guidance counselor, a tutor system, an instructional assistant, and the teachers and that are doing just intervention. Maybe somehow they are doing a single cost objective that way. I just have never seen it. So that's where I would say, this example is kind of misleading because it would have to be a very specific situation with those positions.
Could possibly have the teachers and the instructional assistants and the tutor. They could all be providing small group tutoring. It's just a guidance counselor that's a little bit kind of weird.
Yeah, that one throws me off a bit. And that's just because of the way they have this whole form formatted, right? There's another sample, I think, later. And if not, then we'll come back to this and I'll point out another alternative. But yeah, that would be my concern with this kind of blanket statement. All right, let's go to the next one. Okay, this one is not from CSAM. I did not use the PAR sample in CSAM because I do not like it. I think it's a terrible example. So if you look at CSAM and you look at the periodic sample, you'll look at it and go, oh, this is why April didn't like it, because it basically reports some percentages. And I don't think that's sufficient for federal requirements. But this is a sample that we used to use back probably during the OMB circular days still. And of course, since then we find things that are better than this, but this is just a great place to start. So on this, what are some good takeaways that you see for this multi-funded person?
Is it down to the hour?
It is down to the hour. Yeah.
Not quarter hour, but hour.
Yeah, down to the half hour, not as anal retentive as CDE, so that's nice still.
And other ideas, friends?
It's okay if you're scared. We can go the flip side. Is there anything that you see that you don't like so much that you think might not be as helpful?
There's differences between funded and works down at the bottom, so I don't know how that plays out.
Yeah, that's a good question. So this sample is not terrible. I will say it says program and it says activities. That's nice. Don't really know, again, they have a place for title. This sample doesn't have that filled out because whoever created it didn't think that far ahead. But the cost objective is not entirely clear with this form on its own, right? This is another case where we probably have to look at the duty statements to see what their aim was for cost objectives and what they were doing to kind of understand how it's working. Because I don't know if Title I prep work is for coaching or for something else. I don't know parent conference, how it relates totally to Title I. So I kind of have to look at what the duties are to see how those fit together. It's not a terrible example, but it does leave some questions, right? And then that box that you were just talking about at the bottom is something over here in this bottom corner, is something that isn't required, right? This is something someone created at some point in time to use as like a precursor to that reconciliation stage I mentioned. So what they did basically was they put in hours funded. So that's saying budget. The budget, this is your budget, and they gave this form to the person. They filled out their hours. It automatically totaled and gave them hours worked here. And then it calculated a variance so that they could see on a spot, oh, we're going to need to adjust by this much. You know, it's a great tool in the reconciliation process if you want to shortcut it and make it all connected and calculate on its own. The caveat being, what we found is when people used that box, they were using it inappropriately. They were basically taking it and the staff was trying to complete their hours to match the budget rather than filling it out how they worked, which kind of defeats the purpose of the whole time and effort scheme, right? Like the idea is to be close, but like not try to meet your budget. The idea is to perform the services as intended through your duty statement and record what actually happens and see if it matches up, because a budget is a guess too, right? So we don't want to match a guess. We want to give the reality so that we can adjust our guess going forward, if that makes sense. So that I am a huge fan of this idea. I'm a numbers person. I like things to automate. So I like it in theory, but it's something to be wary of. If you're going to use something like that, ensure that your staff is trained appropriately to record their hours as they should. Because if not, they sign off on it, the supervisor signs off on it, and then you're back in that realm of trouble. If someone's putting in what wants to be said to meet budget, it's technically a fraudulent depiction of the time. That's a horrible word to use, and I don't like to use fraudulent, but that's just a generalization, right? No one's thinking that anyone is intentionally trying to be fraudulent, but that is the implication. So we have to be careful with that, because if you're audited, it could be, seen as a little suspect if every month they look at those things that you've included and it always matches. Just another takeaway that I like from this form, though, on the other side of things I like, they have this, it's not robust by any means, but they do have a little section that gives like some simplified, generalized directions. Like, hey, you have to do it every month. You have to do it in half-hour increments. Don't forget your funding. Enter one activity per row. Makes it a little clearer as to some of the guidance that you should be completing this form in a certain way. Are there any questions about this one?
Not seeing any people.
Okay, thank you. My screen of the people is small, so I can't really tell. All right. So this is another sample from CSAM. And this is actually one that we do see pretty often. So this is going back to that option to have a semi-annual for someone who is working multiple cost objectives, but on a set schedule, right? So if you had like a lead title, a lead teacher doing coaching out of Title II, but they also do, teaching their own courses during the day, right? They're probably on a set schedule because they have classes that they have to meet, and then periods where they have to either be in on other classrooms, observing other teachers, or providing some kind of assistance or whatnot. So maybe they have a set schedule. An intervention specialist, they also might have a set schedule, but maybe they're serving Title I and Title III. So like there are different ways that this can be used for different positions. You can see the periodic certification form. It's pretty general, like that very first one we looked at. Are there anything that you can see wrong with this portion of the form on the left? I don't hear anything, but let's go back to what we said on the first one. Again, the cost objectives, not really clear on the way that they titled it on this form. That's probably my only real big beef about it, is that I don't get a good feel for what the cost objectives are by saying program ABC. If it said Title I intervention and Title III intervention, I would probably understand it a little bit more. If they had the position name on here, I would probably understand it a little bit more. They don't have those two things, so it's a little bit murkier. The schedule would probably back it up a little bit better. But you can see it also has this thing where it says type of schedule, right? So it could be that weekly, their schedule is the same. It could be that daily, it could be bi-weekly, whatever it is, whatever schedule's attached should match it. So this example on the right is their weekly schedule. So they're saying weekly, it is the same, right? So that's what we would expect. We'd expect to see weekly checked, all the programs that they have marked in here, mentioned as cost objectives over here. And this would be sufficient for someone who's multi-funded, or multiple cost objectives, I should say, but on a set schedule. So this one's pretty popular with people who have positions who are on set schedules. We see this pretty often, maybe not this exact format, but this idea of using a predetermined schedule. It kind of makes life easier for a lot of people. Are there any questions on this one?
I'm not seeing any.
Okay, great. Okay, so now we're getting into samples that are harder to read. Sorry about that. But the reason why they're harder to read is these are actual samples now from school districts in the past. So these will all look different, or maybe a little similar, but mostly different. So on this one, we have a PAR, or they called it a TAL. I don't know which way they said that, but time accounting log. And I used this sample from one of our federal stimulus reviews, so it's a little bit different than most federal programs that we document, especially since they're temporary. But what are thoughts that you're seeing between these two forms here? And I'll give you a minute to kind of look through it and see how they're related. So what are some things that maybe that you like, that you think are good on this form?
Objective is clear on that first form. I like that.
Subjective, yeah, they have a clear statement there, huh? I do like that it's kind of predetermined. It's that's not applicable to every position, but for these ESSER positions, it was a little easier to do that with. Is there anything else anyone likes about this form?
Not seeing anything else, April.
Okay.
I like that. I like those clear cost objectives too, and like the key, so you can just enter the.
Yeah, and I've seen that with a lot of different LEAs, and they'll use it a little bit differently at every single one. This one's a little easier with the ESSER 3 funds to do it. more generally, but some of them get really specific sometimes. It's really interesting to see the different ways that people might do it. What about the things that you don't like so much? Is there anything that kind of triggers anything for anyone?
I heard too busy, a lot of stuff on here.
Does have a lot of stuff on here. I would say some of their cost objective might have been maybe they broke it down too much, because some of it that seems repetitive, but that's okay. That's how they chose to do it. But it looks like they're accounting for all their hours supposedly, and so that's good. And although I don't like looking at busy stuff, you don't want to see my timesheet. It's even more of a nightmare. But that's probably why I don't like them. Is there anything like actually maybe either wrong or maybe potentially risky about this form at all?
Signature page,
The signature page, is that what you said?
it's a little
Yeah.
different that you're not sure if someone is actually seeing the time that's being entered. It would be a separate process.
Yeah, I think that that's my one note that I had was like, it's great that you're doing all of this and that you have this signature page that you're accounting for it. But I kind of asked the question of why? Why is it separate? What risk do you run in having multiple forms now running around? Like, how do you ensure that it stays with it and that it's, how do you file it? Like, so I would probably have more questions on their process. And just not because I think anything's wrong with their time accounting, but just because, you know, anytime there's another element of risk, it gives you more questions as to why that risk is there. So when my team comes to do a federal program monitoring review, we don't look at just the time and effort. We actually look at the procedures to ensure that you have internal controls that are sufficient. And if we see something like this, we might say, hey, this isn't in your procedures, or maybe it's in your procedures, but I don't understand why it's separate. Can you just explain it to me? And if it brings up something else that might be a risk, we might say, hey, you should build more into this procedural document and retrain staff to make sure everyone's on the same page. Because again, as you increase the number of documents, you're just increasing the likelihood that something's going to get missed along the way if it's not some kind of automated system. So it's going to be, it's just more work, it seems like. Granted, they have a very full form, so I'm assuming a lot of it has to do with how much room is left on the page. But I don't know. I didn't do this review, so I have questions. And it's not anything that's like going to cause me to say, oh, this isn't sufficient. You're going to have to, you know, take these drastic actions to correct it. But it just makes me wonder what's going on in there and what was the thought process and how do we make sure that that's the best process for you? And they may have found that when they work with their accounting department, this worked the best way. Who knows? But yeah, that was my one question. It's just why this extra form? All right, let's see. So on this sample, it says it's a semi-annual. And it was for ESSER 2 for an English teacher. It tells you it was for January 1st through June 30th of 23. Do you see anything? I would say the good, but you know, we can talk about the good, but the bad's easier to point out always. Is there anything here that kind of raises some alarms on questions you might have if you were reviewing this?
Job function.
The job function. Yeah, I don't know why it's blank and I don't know what the intention is there. I'm going to guess they're using that as their cost objective, but I don't know. So yeah, the job function being blank and no cost objective really being identified is a little concerning. I think that they think that English teacher under ESSER 2 with everything that happened and the allowability under ESSER 2, that that's enough information. Which may be the case if we had a duty statement, but that's just something that I would automatically see and say, why is this blank? And what does this mean? So I would go back to duty statement, see if I could fill in the blanks. And if not, I'd say, what's going on? What's your procedures? You didn't finish the form. And whoever, the supervisor who signed off on it didn't do anything about it either. So what's the reasoning, right? What's the purpose? Is there anything else that anyone sees that could be something to question?
The dates in this year.
What was that? The dates? Which dates? I'm sorry.
Said that it's supposed to be turned in by January 30th.
Yeah. That's exactly it. It does say at the bottom that it has to be turned in at a certain time, and it's turned in months later. So that would be a red flag if I were a reviewer, because I would go, oh, you don't keep these in a timely manner. My guess would be, and I wasn't on this review either, but I'm going to guess that this was completed when they were due to upload stuff for FPM. That's typically what happens. They go, oh, we have an FPM, we better do these forms. And then they sign them and they upload them and say, we did it. And we go, well, yeah, you didn't do it very, timely. And then if we were to read the bottom of the form, even without going back to their procedures, I would say, you're not even meeting your own procedures. And that is an issue. That's an internal control issue. So just to give you an idea, when we do these reviews, we're looking to get you guys to compliance, right? So we're looking to coach you to where we need to get you. If there's an issue identified, we do have to reconcile it somehow. We have to get some kind of resolution. With this kind of case, it's an allowable position. It was a single cost objective. It doesn't make sense to do any kind of disallowing of monies for the salary. It doesn't make sense, right? This is all about internal control. So a corrective action in this case would be, you need to update your procedures. You need to retrain staff because they are not meeting the deadlines and not meeting your own procedures. And you need to ensure that they're being enforced going forward. So, it's these different issues that come up during FPM. It's a little bit different than audits, right? An audit would say you have a finding because you don't follow your procedures, and therefore all the money might be in jeopardy. Whereas in our compliance reviews, we're working to try and get you to compliance. We're coaching to compliance, so to speak. And sometimes we do have to write findings, and there are disallowances when something can't be supported, but this is a single cost objective. If this was a multiple cost objective, well, there's not enough information anyway, but there could be potential for more corrective action than just fixing your procedures. But that's a different story, and it really is case by case. So it's really like about ensuring that you're documenting everything that you need to say that this activity was allowable and applicable to the program. So this type of action would be more about your procedurals and your internal controls. Okay. This one is a little different. Give you a second to look at it. It does say it's a semi-annual. What are your thoughts on the good on this side, on this one? I heard something, but I couldn't quite hear what it was. Sorry.
There's a description of the duties.
Yeah, description of the duties. So this is what I was saying about the sample that was kind of along the lines of what someone said earlier about putting something about who's being served. This isn't saying specifically who is being served, but it's telling me, because they're ESSER funds, it's less about who is being served and more about what duties and how an office teacher qualifies as allowable under ESSER too, right? So under ESSER, all of these duties that they are mentioning were allowable in response to COVID, which they even put in that verbiage, in response to COVID. So they're making it a lot easier to get to the cost objective and the allowability. So we don't question that as much. What else is going on in this one that you may or may not like?
Supervisor met with the employee. Looks like the beginning of the year,
Mm-hmm.
to make sure they knew what their responsibilities were. So we've got those 2 sets of signatures there acknowledging that they know what they're supposed to do, and then signing at the end that those were the duties that were completed.
Yep, absolutely. I feel like that's a wonderful control to have. Because the reality is duty statements, right? Sometimes we ask for them. They're not federally required to have a duty statement. A duty statement, not every school district has for one reason or another. Sometimes I hear union issues happen, whatever that might be. So duty statements aren't required. So we ask for them, but we can't write a finding based on a duty statement. But this is a really great way to get around the duty statement thing and say, hey, we want you to know that this is your required action. This is what you're expected to do. And having them sign off on that is a great expectation to set. And then to have that on that same page, the follow-up with the semi-annual saying, yeah, did you do it this way, is a really great way to do it. It's probably more than you need to do for a single cost objective employee, but if you want to do that across the board for all your employees, I think that's a great way to kind of get that idea across. Oops, I'm sorry. So yeah, not a requirement to do it this way whatsoever, but I thought that this was a really interesting one because I like that it had the duties and that they made them sign off on it beforehand. And I know at the top it says, it's page 1 of 2, and it's because the second page was just the next semi-annual period. I just didn't include it because these slides are hard to get anything to be legible when you cram more pictures into it. So yeah, so those were my comments on this one. Is they don't outrightly say the cost objective, but they do give you all the information to get there pretty easily. I think the only thing, yeah, even their signature dates are in alignment. See, it says here due January 10th. They signed on the 11th. So they're 1 day late. That's not too bad. That's still in a timely manner. Okay, move on. All right. So this one's really difficult to read. I'm really sorry. It's just the way these reports print and then scan. This is labeled as a semi-annual. What are your thoughts on this one? Good or bad? Oh, and I should point out, I did black out everything but part of names, so you could see that it was 1 employee on 5 lines, and then 1 employee on a different employee on 2 lines. And then I think it's for different months, and you can see that on the right.
Yeah, probably know what the duties are.
We don't know what the duties are.
Yeah, we don't know what the duties are whatsoever. We have no idea about cost objective. Anything else that sticks out is kind of weird. So there's some things I'm gonna pretend like I'm reviewing, and I'm gonna kind of point out the way that I would go through it so that you can kind of get the feel for it. So when I would see this, I would see that they gave a time period for when they ran the report, and it was basically actually January through June of 2022. There's February, March, April, May, June for 1 employee, and only June for another. They ran the report in August, so it is after the fact that they ran it. They signed it though in October. I'm guessing that's what that is. It's either October or December. Either way, not very timely. And then like someone said, yeah, we can't identify cost objectives. We can see program funding, and it looks like can't read this thing. The job code or location or something, it says central office resource teacher, it looks like, and the other one says music teacher. The 1 employee is 100% the same every month, and then the other employee, it looks like they're 20% Title I and 80% something else. I can't read it. And it's signed off as a semi-annual, but they're only signed off in June. So if I'm looking at this as a reviewer, I'm first wondering, okay, the first question I would ask is, oh, is this music teacher someone who was only employed in June? What about the rest of their time? What's the cost objectives and the allowability for Title I, since they're charging Title I, which it may have some allowability, just can't tell. And then maybe they're working a single cost objective and that's why they're on this form, but we would need a duty statement or something to kind of ensure that this is actually allowable 100% as a single cost objective, because I just can't tell. Same thing with the other one. It's 100%, so there might be less questions, especially under, it looks like ESSER 2, I think, but I'm still going to need to know what the cost objective is. So it's just leaving a lot of questions out there, right? I'm not sure why the timing, like this person's missing January, this person's missing all of the year except for June. It's not signed off until October. Cost objectives aren't specific. There's a lot of questions. So I know I said earlier, there's no ugly, except for this one. This one's my ugly sample. And I've seen this one multiple times. And there's one, I'm not going to mention names, but there's one LEA who does this every single year and always has a finding on it and never corrects it. So don't be that person. If you have something like this that you're using, use it as a starting point to build something better. Don't continue to keep doing it. Yeah, this is just something to keep in mind. This is a perfect example of what not to do. And this is just for, single cost objective employees. Their PARs, just to give you an insight, this same district, their PARs looked exactly like this as well. Where they so this bottom person who they're saying is a single cost objective on this form, how they have 2 lines for 1 month, it was like that for multiple cost objective employees too. They would just have 4 or 5 lines, but then they'd have that for every month. So you have to kind of work out where people end and where the months end. And then you have to figure out what their cost objective is and how that works and if it's allowable and if it's allocable. And it's a fun game of just trying to guess and kind of figure it out. So the whole point of these forms is to eliminate that guessing. So this would not be a good example. Any questions on that?
Just that it doesn't look like it's something that somebody at a district made. It looks like it's from some kind of program or something that they have, like an accounting software or something that they have.
Yeah, it's from PeopleSoft. So this is actually a really commonly used program that in the accounting departments is actually, this is usually what our position control reports that we get look like, which is why it raises more questions, because it makes me think this must be predetermined budget percentages because we don't have enough information to think otherwise, right? If you go to like this is a semi-annual, so I'm a little less concerned, but if it was a PAR and it was multiple cost objective employees, it would just be percentages reported. We'd have nothing to base this off of as anything other than budget, other than they ran the report later and signed it later. So it is an automated thing. There are some districts that use some automated systems that work. This is not one of them.
So just do better.
Yeah, do better for sure. Thank you. I love that wording. All right. So those are all the samples I have. So I wanted to kind of go over common issues identified when we're doing monitoring. I mean, we've kind of touched on all of them, I think. So the biggest one that is probably the saddest one, because it's so much more work to reconcile, to get to work through corrective action, is that no time and effort is even maintained. Most districts do maintain something now. I think the ESSER funds are the area where people didn't know they were supposed to maintain during that crazy period of our lives, which is understandable. But for the most part, for other restricted programs, people are pretty good about having something documented. And if not, this is the time to build it. So another issue is that maybe they're paying salaries on budget, but they're never reconciling. So they're never taking that extra step of comparing the actuals. And that usually happens when a program office puts together time and effort requirements and gets it all implemented, but doesn't involve the accounting department. And so there's never that connection made. And so reconciliation is never even considered. And some business offices are really great and they know that they're supposed to be doing something like that, but some of them have no clue about some of these federal requirements that need to happen on their end. So it's really good to start that communication if you don't have it yet.
That brings up a question.
Sure.
I mean, I know every LEA is different, but in reality, who's supposed to do these at a district? Is it HR? Is it the business? Is it the Title I? Or what do you guys see as reviewers?
Yeah.
As who's the overseer of these documents?
So they are federal requirements for those specific federal programs. So usually we see that instigated by the program offices. However, you're right, every district is different. Some have business offices that are much more involved. So I would say like someone larger like San Jose, I've worked with them for years on time and effort. They have a system built in, but their business office was the lead on it. And theirs is a little bit different than everyone's, and they still have some things that I don't love, but like for the most part, they're pretty on it as far as how they document time consistently, right? It really does take a collaboration. I would say most LEAs, the program office instigates it because they're usually aware of the requirement before the business office is. And of course that's, you know, depends on how long the business office staff have been there. If they've been there forever and they've worked with federal programs, they probably had some experience, but we've kind of been in this time period now for, it feels like forever, where there's so much flux in staff that there's a lot of new people coming in and maybe those newer people aren't familiar with those requirements. So it really is a joint effort, but the program staff should be aware of it if nobody else, and start instigating those conversations with the different departments that need to be involved. And sometimes you don't even know who you need to involve until you start asking questions and you find out, oh, this person does this, but then this person does that. And so you end up going around, and it's a great way to get to know people. They might not like you for doing it, but it really opens up that conversation and kind of gets everyone working together on the same page. But if you're not aware of anyone doing it, I would say start asking questions of your business office. If they're aware, if they're not, then you, unfortunately, I don't know, see it how you want, you get to be the champion of it. I always like to be the person who gets to come in and do that, because I feel like, well, if it was a mess before, I can't make it any worse. I get to be the person who helps make it better. So just take it with a grain of salt if you're working through it. It's going to take some time, but definitely start those conversations. Other common issues is just that they have a system, but they don't have it written down. They don't have it formalized. There's no policies and procedures. There's no standardization. So there's really no real controls ensured in the process. So no policies and procedures would give a finding, and it would be basically that you need to create those. Other things is if the documentation is inaccurate or incomplete, and then there's no backup documentation to help fill in the blanks, then we're going to have some issues through the monitoring process. And then if documentation isn't maintained for all applicable employees, that's also an issue we have. If you don't have time and effort for someone, it's very likely that it's going to cause us to have to do some kind of reimbursement of funds for the position or whatever isn't maintained for, I should say, which is never the fun finding, but what we have to do going forward. And then it just instigates more of that. Well, you need to train staff, you need to ensure it's happening. And it goes back to your policies and procedures. So I think policies and procedures are really going to be your main driver initially to make sure that everything gets implemented and that you're doing it consistently. So on that note, thinking about policies and procedures, this is just a slide to kind of help you, coach you through things to think about when you're building those procedures. So it's asking those questions about what are you going to do to make sure that it's right? How do you ensure things are accurate or allowable and allocable? All those tools that we saw, like people putting duty statement issues on those semi-annuals, or having double signatures, having, you know, however the workflows, having that little chart that kind of does the budget to the actual effort and variance. Those are all controls that you can implement. Timelines, signatures, all of these are things that can help you help support your internal controls. You also have to think about things like, how are you doing it in this day and age? Is it hard copy? Is it digital? I'll say CDE is now completely digital with this kind of stuff, which is tedious, but we do it. It's tedious either way. So, but it's really, we're trying to move more digitally as a department. And I think that more schools are doing that as well. I've seen quite a few different things done digitally with time and effort that some work, some don't, some work most of the time. You just have to find the flaws and kind of build in supports for that. When you're doing your procedures, also really helpful. If you're someone like me, I am a visual person. I love a flow chart or a sample form or something to go through. So it's always good to incorporate those and standardize everything that you can to make it so it's less work, less burdensome on your employees and hopefully on your administrators who are in charge of all of this as well. And then training staff regularly, making sure you're updating anything that needs to be updated. When you find a problem, put it on the list of things to update in the procedures next year, revise it, go over it with everyone, make sure those revisions are going to work, and make sure that your staff know what is expected. And that's pretty much everything that, I mean, everything comes back to these procedures really. So going through these different thoughts and building that out will really, really help your program have strong time and effort. I did provide some resources here. The federal fiscal guidance is a document that CDE put out a few years ago. And it walks you through the ideas of procedures and different fiscal issues that you might come across in monitoring. And my division did actually put that one out. The CSAM, the California School Accounting Manual, is put out by our state and federal program office, I think. Is that right? No, School Fiscal Services Division. So they put that out. They have not revised it since 2009. I don't know when or if they're going to. But again, it's a good place to just touch base to see the general requirements for any state and federal restricted program. They have other things in there too, but specifically CSAM, and I should have put it on here, I didn't. CSAM section 905 is the actual section for time and effort. I also included the citation for the Uniform Grants Guidance. So that's where they're telling you, oh, do what you want, but have procedures is going to be at this 200.430I. So you can always go back and read that. I will tell you if you do, please have some caffeine or something because it is dry and not fun. But it's there if you want to look at it. And if you look at it and it raises more questions, shoot me an email or this fiscal monitoring email is also something you can go to for any kind of technical assistance for fiscal questions on federal programs. My team rotates who answers it. So you'll get one of my really pleasant consultants. They're very helpful and very nice about it. And they're pretty timely. So that's also a great way to do it. I didn't leave my email on this slide, but it's on the very first slide if you go back to it. So you all are more than welcome to email me at any time. And my one caveat would be, and I should have mentioned it earlier, I didn't, on this Uniform Grants Guidance, it is currently under revision, of course, because the last time they did it was 2014. They're doing it now, but they said that there are not any changes to time and effort. So rest assured, everything I told you is not moot. It would still go forward the way that I presented it to you. There may be other fiscal changes that happen, but this is the only one that I know of that's crucial that is not changing. The citation may change, but for now, this is the correct one. And it's supposed to get published, I think, in the next few weeks. So keep your ears to the ground for more information on changes that may be coming up. And that's everything I have. Are there any questions?
Yeah, we have a question.
Sure.
So for time and effort, I know that definitely for federal funding is a requirement and an expectation for us to do. As we get additional funding, like we get the ELOP money, we get the multiplier money. Is this also an expectation for state funding?
Okay, I'm going to see if I heard all of it right because it was kind of going in and out. So you were saying as you get new funding, like state funding, is that what you said? Is it an expectation to have time and effort for that as well? Is that what you were asking?
Yeah, some examples were ELOP or equity multiplier funding.
Okay, Well, I can't speak to ELOP because even though that is a state-funded program, the Expanded Learning Division has asked my team to assist with monitoring on the fiscal side of things for ELOP, and we are looking at time and effort for that program. And the reason for it being that even though it's not a federal program, and we're not going to be using the same citations, right? We're not going to be looking at that UGG guidance because that is not applicable to ELOP, right? That's a federal law. But we look at state laws, and the way that CSAM is written is to encapsulate anything for restricted state programs as well. So time and effort is referenced in CSAM as applicable to restricted state programs. So there's like a lot of like nutrition funds that have requirements for time and effort, whether they're federal or state, and ELOP is one of them as well. So it depends on the funding of the program and what the standards are. I would say if you get new funding and you have a question as to whether or not time and effort applies, reach out to the program office, find out from them, and they can provide additional guidance to ensure that you're getting all the information you need. I just happen to know for ELOP specifically, it is required.
That answer your question? Any more questions for April? I'm not seeing any more questions, April. Thank you so much for explaining such a complicated topic in such an easy to understand way. I know the samples are appreciated as well as the non-examples. So we really appreciate your time.
Yeah, not a problem. Anytime you have more questions on the fiscal end, please feel free to reach out. I'm more than happy to provide more guidance.
All right. Thank you so much, April. We
Thank you.
appreciate you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Great thing we have the recording, so I will